In February 2020, the Brooks Institute hosted approximately 80 of the most influential actors in the animal protection community to discuss the current state of the animal protection movement. Some of these Congress delegates volunteered to respond to big questions. Here are the responses to the question, where should the animal protection movement be going?
The animal protection movement needs to become more powerful than the forces that are subjugating and oppressing animals. And to do that, we need to unite, and we need to come together at events like this and share strategies and share ideas and keep growing.
I think the animal protection movement needs to draw on its membership of people who are very committed and very passionate about what they believe in and help other people keep growing in an infectious way.
I think the animal protection movement is multifaceted. There's no doubt. There's lots and lots of threads. There's no magic bullet. So whether you are campaigning for wild animals or for domesticated pets or for sanctuaries or any of those things, whether you're campaigning for anti-vivisection or for animal rights law, all of those things are going to count. So where should we be going? Everyone should be carrying on doing what they do. We're just doing one small part with animal rights law. And I think there will be a movement of change.
So I think there's lots and lots of goodwill among a lot of different groups and individuals. I do think we need to find ways where sometimes competition is healthy, but I think sometimes competition can set us all back. So I'm a big proponent of coalitions. I think they're really important, and I think it's real important for progress for animals. They can be challenging, right? But I think another way of getting to what we want for animals is to see where can we work together? Or even if we don't work fully together, where can I share information with another group? Where can a group in China find out more about an issue that I don't know about, but many other animal organizations know about? So I think I would urge the movement going forward. We need to have healthy debate. Absolutely. It doesn't mean we all sit and say, yes, 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 you're absolutely right. But I think to find ways of filling gaps, being strategic about that, and then seeing how we can work together, work to our best competency, but support other organizations doing good work.
So where should the animal protection movement be going? Well, frankly, right now, we are all working in bubbles, and we need to break out of those bubbles. We need to be collaborative, we need to be innovative, and we need to work in new ways, new geographies, with new partners that we never have before. And if we don't do that, we'll just keep running on the hamster wheel and we won't get anywhere. So we need to get off the hamster wheel and do something different.
In terms of the question of where should the animal movement be going and how should it get there, again, I would sort of question the question and say there are many directions to go and there are many movements within which animals can be incorporated in order to get there. So there are people who are concerned about the environment and wild animals and protecting natural ecosystems. It seems to me that we have an opportunity in the animal protection movement to talk about the end of factory farming and the end of the industrialized use of animals to open up huge amounts, and the feed crop that goes to feed them, to open up huge areas of the land for rewilding, to restore watersheds, and to reimagine what it means to value your land in terms of its carbon sequestration, the health of the topsoil, the natural biological systems that will return. So wildlife is intrinsically embedded in the possibility of changing the way we farm animals. In terms of social justice, we can reimagine the use of land for a restorative justice process. So the knowledge of indigenous peoples and how they have protected the land can be reincorporated into our land management policies and allow indigenous peoples to reclaim the land as they remembered it, and thereby not only to rewild that land and find other uses for it, but bring a measure of restorative justice to the injustice over the acquisition of land that took place during the colonial period. So this is an indigenous rights issue. This is also an issue surrounding the historic marginalization of peoples of color around the world. And then in terms of economic opportunities and transitions to clean energy, there are all sorts of ways that animals can be a part of that. If animals particularly are valuable in sequestering carbon through their footprints, as is the case made in regenerative agriculture, perhaps the animal becomes more valuable alive than dead. And so therefore we have a restoration of the animals back to their own ecosystem so that a cow lasts and lives for 20 years sequestering carbon and becomes an ally in our efforts to resist climate change. And that in itself is a restoration of our responsibilities to the animals who've exploited us. So farming becomes a sanctuary movement. And the animals become part of a remembrance of what we used to do, but also a reparation for what we used to do. So there are many directions that we can take going forward. What we need to do is think of these as a holistic, diverse, ecological, political, and cultural system of diversification, away from the monocultures of crops, away from the monocultures of national and racial identity, to what's much more integrated, diverse, and therefore resilient system. Because unless we have maximal diversity, we will not be able to survive the climate crisis.
The animal protection movement needs to be thinking more about how dietary change is linked up with broader social change. So I think, in terms of the aim I think most about, it's about changing the way we eat, getting animals less present in the production cycle. When they are there, treated much better. And we're going to do that as an animal movement if we're also attending to the way in which the problems in the farm system aren't just affecting animals. They are affecting human beings and the environment in kind of profound ways. So one of the ways I think we can be effective in the animal movement is aligning our interests more tightly with other movements like anti-racism and the ecology movement. So in terms of the direction we should be heading, this suggests we should be heading in more coalitional directions, but where we're coming from a place of really trying to work with other movements that are anti-oppression movements. Another way I think we're going to get to a better, more effective animal protection movement, in addition to working more coalitionally, is working in more community-specific ways. We tend to often think about strategies that are going to kind of sweep across the country, affect the way everybody eats, but most of us eat more as individuals, as families, as communities. So we need vehicles of activism that are speaking to particular religious communities, speaking to different kinds of Christians, different kinds of Jews, speaking to Buddhists, speaking to the Black community, speaking to the Latinx community. People from those communities being supported to imagine what it means to change the default of the way we eat in a more compassionate way for animals and the planet in different ways. So instead of imagining an overarching kind of framework, we have these community-specific campaigns which work towards larger goals, but end up looking quite different. So Black veganism might look different than a mainstream vegan or a kind of health-oriented vegan. But we try to support that as a movement, recognizing that there can be diversity within an overall kind of orientation for change.
When I started, it was a few years after Peter Singer had first published Animal Liberation. That was published in 1975, and I came into the movement formally in 1979. So we had this first generation of people who were thinking not only about protection, but about rights and how could we establish rights for animals. That was a huge change in the movement, and it also changed how we approached the topics. If you break animal protection down, you've got animals in research, hunting, trapping, fur, companion animals, which is the most robust area, even though it's a very small number of animals when you compare it to research. Well, not to research, but to farmed animals. The movement, when I came into it, was focused on animal use and research and fur, hunting and trapping. And those were the issues that we were debating about, that we were marching and protesting about, and that we were focusing all of our time on. In 1979, there were no animal law classes. There was nothing called animal law. There were no case books. There was nothing. We had a blank sheet. And so we started from scratch and built over time. With the use of animals in research, there were massive protests that we don't see today. Okay, there were hundreds of people who were risking arrest and getting arrest. And so as lawyers, we were expected to get them out of jail and deal with the system, the criminal justice system. Those protests were an important part of the movement at that time. And here we are in 2020, protests still matter, but a lot less than they did back then. A big way that the movement has changed is that it has become far more professional. You have people now, groups like Animal Equality and the Humane League, that do statistical studies and do research to tell us how to create change, how to influence consumers. That's really an interesting change that we've seen. The professionalization, again, going back to 1979 when I first came in, there were no lawyers or doctors or nurses or psychologists or philosophers other than Singer involved in the movement. That's all changed. We now have a robust group or groups of these professionals who are focusing on animal rights and animal protection. The biggest change has been in the last 10 years, where we have what I call the disruptor groups. Beyond Meat, Impossible Foods, Miyoko's Cheese, Tofurky. This is now several billion-dollar industry. And with my focus on farmed animals, I every day get emails from a lot of different meat publications, and I can tell you they are scared. They are very disturbed about this disruptor industry. They'd like to see it go away, and it's not going to go away. And that's one of the biggest changes and the most powerful changes I've seen in the animal movement. But over time, there are indicators of change over time. It seems like you can go on for years and sometimes decades trying to fight something, and you don't see a lot of progress, and it can get very depressing and very distressing. And then something will happen, like Ringling goes out of business, and you think, oh my God, we did it. How did we do that? Let's recreate that. What was it that we all did? What I think is that if you look at this hand as the problem, we come at it, all of us, from different angles. Some of us litigate, some of us legislate, some of us go out and protest, others educate, and it all works together to create the change. I have worked on a variety of issues. I'm a generalist, so I've worked on companion animals, I've worked on captive wildlife research. What I'm focused on now, and I think more of the movement is, and I think it's a good direction, is farmed animals. Why? Because as any of us will tell you, it's the greatest number of animals by far, 9 billion in the US alone killed each year. It's intensive suffering over long periods of time, years in some cases, and it impacts just so many animals in such a terrible way that at least I believe I have to focus on that. With whatever time I have left on this planet, I need to focus on that. And in particular, I want to focus on China because they're raising 10 times as many animals as we are in the US. The impacts of factory farming, as it's commonly called, are serious welfare issues both in the so-called factory farm and in the slaughterhouse. So much pain and suffering that we really need to focus on it. But also there are impacts on the environment, degradation of water, degradation of soil, degradation of air pollution, impacts on the people who work in these places. We call that environmental justice impacts on the neighboring communities around these large facilities, impacts on our public health, and food safety, and climate change. Factory farms are a significant contributor to climate change. So you have all of these impacts all swirling around this one cause, factory farms. For me, that's where I need to spend my time. But the other thing I think the movement needs to do is that for many years we've been like warring tribes, not trusting each other, not working together as well as we should. Yes, there is a lot of collaboration, and I've always focused on trying to collaborate with others. But what we lack is an overall association of the groups, something similar to what the environmental movement has. And I've done a lot of work looking at what the environmental movement has. It brings together groups as disparate as World Wildlife Fund on the one end, very, very conservative, and Earth First on the other. And they do it quietly, but they work together, they combine lists, donor lists, they combine money, so that they're able not only to do the forward-thinking work, but also to do the kind of work you need to do when you're getting attacked. And that's what concerns me a lot about the animal movement. We don't have that infrastructure. So when we make progress, great, but what happens when we have pushback and we don't have each other to rely on? I think it would be enormously helpful for us to mature as a movement. As a whole, we could do more together. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts, is the old saying. We could do a lot more together than we currently are doing.
I think the animal protection movement needs to be careful not to become elitist. And the place that we really need to go is to really become more diverse and engage more young people and provide opportunities for younger people, older people. One of the things I like to say is that everyone has a contribution to make, and we're looking in our own organizations to make ways that people can hopefully get engaged and become active in the movement. And we need to build the movement right now, and we need to broaden and deepen our engagement with the community.
I think that climate change is a really interesting opportunity to bring animals into the political discussions that people are having right now, because animal agriculture is such an important part of what contributes to climate change and what we need to resist in order to mitigate climate change. And wild animals will be leading victims of climate change. And so one of the main populations we need to assist as part of our climate adaptation efforts. So in this particular political moment over the next 10 years, when people are talking about how to completely restructure society in order to adapt to climate change and in order to limit the effects of climate change, I think we have a real opportunity to bring animals into that conversation and include their needs and vulnerabilities in the conversation when we figure out how to restructure our societies to be more resilient in a world reshaped by human activity.
So I've been part of the animal protection movement for a very long time. I've been vegan since I was 23, and I've been an animal activist my entire life. And I think that what we need to do is continue to actually be more inclusive and lift up the voices of marginalized people. There are people that are doing amazing work, and usually when we look at the experts in the field, it's all white folks. It's usually white men, it's usually white cis straight men, and their voices are dominant, and their perspectives, however, are not the majority. And so we really need to work on mobilizing and really empowering people that are already doing this amazing work everywhere on behalf of animals and really lifting up their voices. I think that's the only way that we can actually be a really powerful, truly impactful movement.
The animal movement is unique because we really do lack data, especially of animals coming into animal shelters. So at Best Friends, we want to stop the killing of dogs and cats in shelters by 2025. And we realized we don't have a good data set, like what's going on with the dogs and cats coming in. So we have decided to have a business intelligence unit that sole purpose is to try to get data, to try to find out how many dogs and cats are coming in each shelter in the nation. It's easier for governmental shelters because you could do FOIA requests, the sunshine laws, but for nonprofits, it's really, really hard. So we're trying to collaborate with groups to try to get them to give us their data so we know where to focus to try to stop the killing of dogs and cats. The other thing that's so important is keeping pets in their home. And so we've collaborated with Shelter Love, which is a shelter data company, to try to figure out why people are giving up their pets. And what we found through this huge data set is that 14.8% of people are giving up dogs and cats because of housing issues. In the United States, there's a housing crisis, and it's very sad when people are homeless. But a lot of people are homeless because they can't find a place to live with their dog and cat, and they don't want to give that relationship up. So we basically, want to try to keep pets in the families. We're focusing on trying to evolve animal shelters from just being animal shelters where you drop the animal off, maybe they get adopted, maybe they get euthanized, to community resource centers to figure out how to keep that dog and cat with the owner, because that's probably, for most of the pets, the very, very best thing. So we're trying to work with the Walton Foundation to start community resource centers. The first one in Bentonville, Arkansas, to really change, have a paradigm shift for our shelters. Because a lot of shelters are afraid of the term no kill, but
For us, no kill means saving a minimum of 90% of the dogs and cats that come into each shelter. Some folks have gone to socially conscious sheltering, which is good. But again, we feel like you need to measure. Measurement is important, and we need to know how we're doing. So that's why we stick with no kill being 90%. But again, it's interesting because Best Friends started out as an animal sanctuary in Little Kanab, Utah. We have 3,500 acres, beautiful land. We have 1,600 animals, dogs, cats, horses, pigs, wildlife, parrots, and we have thousands of visitors who come through every year. A state-of-the-art veterinary clinic. We have veterinary externships to try to get people to, think about, do they want to start an animal sanctuary? And if so, these are the challenges you might have. But we see the sanctuary as our spirit, but yet our mission is to stop the killing of dogs and cats in shelters.
I think the animal protection movement should be asking really deep questions and asking society to consider really deep questions, such as, why are we breeding animals? So we're breeding them for multiple purposes, but are there other ways for us to live our lives without creating what we end up seeing as problems? We're breeding animals for companions, for food, for research, when we know there are alternatives to all those kinds of things. And so I think an ultimate question is, why are we doing this, right? And why are we not thinking about how we can live in harmony with the animals who already exist in the world? So I think that's something that we need to be considering in order to move the movement forward and to be considering success in broader terms.
Yeah, I think that in order to have a goal and to know where we should be going, we need to look at diversity and who we're including. So in order to have that great impact, we need to go toward including as many voices as we can, to incorporate as many methodologies, strategies, dimensions as we can. And we do that by including voices that maybe have been excluded, maybe not looked at well enough, so that when we develop this language that I think is crucial to the movement, owning a language that speaks to the general public, but also ourselves, then we obviously have to include those diverse voices.
I'm actually excited where the animal protection movement is going, and part of it is the beginnings of this think tank. I think for a long, long while we have needed something like this that will really look at what are the fundamental big issues that we are facing as a movement. Why are we still stuck as a movement in a place where, when you compare it to, say, the LGBTQ movement or other social justice movements, we haven't quite ticked that threshold. I think we're very close. I think we're starting to see large reports about the impacts of animal agriculture, population, issues that sometimes are very difficult to discuss, but I think we have to. So I think big picture is we need to look at those fundamental and critical issues that really have yet to get us over to the place of making animal protection a movement that everyone can embrace and that they don't see it as fringe. I think we're very, very close. You can feel it. It's very palpable. One need only look at the growth of alternative plant-based foods in that movement to see that threshold is right there. And I feel actually in my lifetime, we're going to reach it. Just needs a little bit of push. And like I said, I think we also need to reach the youth and really inspire them to take action. I think Greta, the young spokesperson for climate change, is an example of the power of one person. And I think we've talked a lot at this conference about the individual and individual animals. I think it's also a time for us to show that individual voices, people can make a difference. And that's part of what I hope that we can do, is just inspire people to speak out, to get involved, because basically we're a movement comprised of individuals, and I think a lot of people feel disempowered right now, and that's really what we need to do.
So many people are involved in animal protection today, and we're all passionate, we all have great ideas, but sometimes we're not talking to each other. And so what happens is we see duplication of efforts and sometimes even working in counterproductive ways. So I think being able to communicate more, work together more effectively, come up with more global strategies that are interdisciplinary and intersectional, that's what we need to be focusing on, because the problems are broad and deep, and we need everybody to be working together to make a change.
I would like to see an animal protection movement that places more importance on farm animals, animals that are raised and killed for food, because these are the animals that die in the largest number, and they have absolutely horrible lives. Hens spend their entire lives in cages so small they can't even spread their wings. And broiler chickens are bred to grow so fast, so big, that they can't even bear the weight of their own body, and they collapse in the farms, and they can't even reach the food or the water. So it's really, really important that as a movement, we focus in that area where we can have the most impact and help the most animals. And I think that is factory farming.
You know, there's an interesting question presented today about where animal protection should be going and how we should get there. And the question was posed as, what is the greatest challenge or what is the great opportunity? And I see these two things coalescing at this extraordinary time in the history of the animal protection movement. On the one hand, you've got the consumption of animals increasing. You've got climate change spitting us out like we are just a bad idea. All the science says we've got a handful of years to figure this out before the Earth is largely uninhabitable for lots of humans and lots of animals. On the other hand, that reality gives us an extraordinary opportunity because people are paying attention. Either we're paying attention because there's enough information out there about the harm that our diet is doing to the animals, about the harm that our diet is doing to our own bodies, and about the harm that it's doing to the planet, that you have to have your head so deliberately stuck in the sand not to have one of those points of entry. So the opportunity is within this crisis point that we've reached, that enough of us are paying attention, that I think if we collectively can get our messaging right and can lead with love and non-judgment, we just might be able to make a pretty rapid shift.
Well, I think we have to think about the role that we play as advocates, and whether within that greater umbrella we are lawyers or academics or any other role that we're playing. We have to think about the sort of norm entrepreneurship that we're actually intending to create. We want to be bringing animals to a level that they are actually included in all of the kind of architecture of our social and political systems, right? The kind of liberal ethics that have driven the creation of the systems that we all live in. And animals are fundamentally misclassified as it currently stands. You know, there is a problem with the way that our legal system and that our social cultures and other constructs actually look at animals. Our job as advocates of any stripe is to think about how we can change those norms, how we can raise that kind of cultural literacy. And that also means to some level just educating people, being able to get a true core understanding out there through really well-constructed narratives, what is happening to animals on factory farms and elsewhere, but being able to, you know, be very strategic about that and put some sort of engineering into the narratives that we are constructing, and then think about what sort of tactical roles we're playing. Well, you know, as norm entrepreneurs, we may be thinking, okay, we can design the strategy, we can design the ideas and the tactics, but maybe once we build a model and that model is replicable, maybe now we're attracting the for-profit sort of sectors to, for example, carry out litigation ideas that can be self-incentivizing through, you know, their potential to make money after we have established the model and we have shown, you know, its potential sort of proof of concept through a test case, for example. I think you can apply that concept to things like, you know, really well-designed vegan food. Once we have been able to connect the right people and build the right sort of strategic and ideological concepts, we are then able to sort of hand it off to the market, and the market can amplify those effects. But our job as normal entrepreneurs is to build that initial modeling and that initial strategy.
Because I'm a firm believer in doing what you know, my primary expertise other than animal law is environmental law. And I see the idea that animals are part of the environment as being non-controversial. Those who don't support animal rights as they themselves conceive of it can still be in favor of environmental law and good policy. And since very few people would argue that animals are not part of the environment, I believe that if we come at the issue of animal rights and animal protection via environmental protection and environmental ethics, I do believe we can shape hearts and minds without that being an actual pitched battle to shape hearts and minds.
Well, I think we need to be moving towards the center, moving into the mainstream. The animal protection movement, if you will, really is still on the fringe. And I'd like to see it move right into the mainstream to become an integral part of our culture, or cultures, to become normative, and especially in areas like science and academia, where it is still held as a fringe or extremist viewpoint to care about the well-being of other animals. I want to see it right in there, just the way human rights is talked about, studied, and lauded in the academy and in other institutions. I want to see the rights of other animals on a par with human rights.
I think the animal protection movement fundamentally is a social justice movement, and I think that historically it's been somewhat in a bubble and hasn't reached out to other social justice movements. I think increasingly, and I'm an animal rights vegan activist, so I've been a vegan since 1985, and I think the vegan component is becoming more critically evaluated, and what is it to be a vegan? And to me, it has to do with an aspiration to live as kindly as possible and challenging and not participating in systems of oppression. So identifying aligned systems of oppression that connect to animal agriculture and animal exploitation, and working with those groups and individuals together to challenge this massive system that exploits animals. It harms people who work in these factory farms. It harms neighbors who live near these factory farms. It harms consumers who eat factory farmed foods and don't have opportunities for healthy plant-based foods. So my current thinking, and it's based on looking at systems and structures and government subsidies, institutional resources and programs, is to try to start getting some of these resources to reform our food system, to do urban farming, for example, empower people in cities to grow their own food. In suburban areas, instead of having lawns and paying somebody to mow the lawn and put down fertilizer, have a gardener that actually produces a box of vegetables every week, And in rural areas, shifting from animal agriculture to plant-based, we could feed more people with fewer resources by growing plants and eating them directly, instead of by growing corn and soy and other feed crops and harvesting those and feeding them to animals. So it's more efficient. So shifting that system and the structures that support it, crop insurance and the tax breaks and the tax incentives that are in place to incentivize plant-based, community-oriented agriculture is to me a huge opportunity for the animal vegan movement and to align with other social justice movements.
I would love to see more marginalized voices being sort of put at the forefront in terms of strategy, in terms of experiences and perspectives. I feel like marginalized communities, or people in marginalized communities, have a lot of insight into things like otherizing, or feeling othered and experiencing being othered, exploitation and discrimination and all these things. And so I can't see a reason why there shouldn't be a priority to listen to what we have to say and to put some of our ideas and perspectives at the forefront of the work.
So one thing, and this will echo some of the other things I've said, but I think that it's really important for the animal protection movement to attend to codifying the changes that we're seeing in public opinion right now. And so I'm not saying everyone needs to be working on law, but law is how our society codifies its values. And so if we don't codify the changes in public demands and public opinions as to animals, this could be a very ephemeral or very symbolic moment for animals. And we want these changes to be real and we want them to last. So I think that's really important. And an important piece of that is making sure not just that these changes are codified in law, but that those changes are enforceable, that there are enforcement mechanisms so that after my lifetime, the things that I've been working for will persist and these will be permanent changes for the animals.